Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and my guest today is the incredible journalist Lynne O'Donnell. Lynne's career has been diverse and impressive, and her work on Afghanistan spans the entirety of our post-9/11 presence into today. Lynne has been a senior correspondent for Reuters and worked as the Kabul Bureau Chief for the AFP and the AP between 2009 and 2017. Lynne has also worked in strategic communications and now is a columnist for foreign policy. She also hosts her own weekly podcast for 8 a.m. Media, and for viewers out there who know, 8 a.m. Media is an excellent place to find the ground truth of what's happening in the Taliban's Afghanistan now that the Taliban have a stranglehold over traditional media inside the country. Many of my audience are going to be familiar with Lynne because you found yourself under arrest by the Taliban and were forced to retract your prior journalism about 2.5 years ago in a very interesting circumstance that we're going to get to later, but I want people to know we're going to talk about that, but we have a lot of ground to cover beforehand, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to hear your story today, Lynne. Thanks for being here.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my honor to be here, Beth. Thanks for the invitation.
Anytime. I would love to start with your first coverage of Afghanistan. You know, how close to 9/11 did you start developing, contacts in the country? When did you first make it here, or to there, not to here,
to there,
to there,
Yeah.
And just kind of what was the situation like when you first started covering Afghanistan?
Well, I was a China reporter for many years, and I was based in Beijing for Reuters and for an Australian newspaper. At that time, I was working for the Australian as their Beijing-based China correspondent. And I got on a train, nothing much was happening, but China was on the front page of every newspaper every day of the world. It was the biggest story in the world. And so I had a very big job. I was in the paper every day, and I really enjoyed it. And there was a bit of a lull in what was going on, and I had some time, so I got on a train. I flew first to Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang province, which borders Pakistan and Afghanistan and Kyrgyzstan. And I got on a train to go to Kashgar, which is the big Silk Road trading post, which is not very far from the Pakistan border at all. And at that stage, it was a very long train ride, 2.5 days. And I got on the train and was in a sleeper carriage, of course, and the next morning on the dot of 9 o'clock, the lady who worked for me and with me in my office in Beijing called, and I said, yeah. She said, I just called to say hello. I said, you never call anyone just to say hello, what's going on? She said, I thought you might like to know what's going on in America. I'm like, yeah. She said, well, 30,000 people are dead in New York, and the president is missing. And then the line went dead. And I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm looking out of the window, a little table between the bunks, looking out of the window at this black gravel desert that's going by. And there was no signal on the phone because it's literally the middle of nowhere. And every now and then a little old man on a donkey would go by. Or the other way, And it was 2 hours. I'm sitting there looking at my phone thinking 30,000 people are dead and the president is missing. What's happened? Armageddon, And in Chinese language, in Mandarin, in Chinese language, it's very difficult to get those numbers mixed up. 30, 300, 3,000, 30,000. So she just mixed it up in English and said 30,000 when she meant 3,000. And I didn't find that out until 2 hours later when a signal came in and a friend of mine, American friend in Beijing, called me to let me know what was going on. And he said that for the first time ever, he never did it. He put the TV on before he went to bed in time to see the second plane go into the second tower of the World Trade Center. And so he was able to tell me while we had the line what was going on. And so I still had something like 15 or 18 hours to go before I got to Kashgar. And when I got there, I didn't even check into my hotel. I went straight to a cafe, which was full of Uyghurs, Chinese Muslims, not Chinese Muslims at all, Central Asian Muslims. And they looked like hell was about to be unleashed on them. They knew what was coming. The Chinese authorities had already taken footage of the 9/11 attacks in New York and DC, and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, I think, off the airwaves. So I didn't see that footage until I went home to Australia for Christmas 2001. But when I got back to Beijing, I stayed in Kashgar for a little while. My bosses in Sydney didn't want me to go into Pakistan, even though the border was still open. I could have easily have got a visa at the border and crossed in, but they were a little bit consumed with what was happening in America at the time, understandably. So I hung out. I think I managed to wedge myself onto the bottom, like a box story from nowhere. Who cares? And I got back to Beijing, and, from having been one of the star foreign correspondents in the paper every day, I was on the edge of the world now. Nobody cared anymore about China. And so I had to work out a way to get back onto the front page. And so what I did was get on a plane, and I flew to Tashkent, and I went from Tashkent overland, I think, down to a little scrappy town on the Uzbek Afghan border called Termez, and I think I was the second foreign correspondent to get there, to this little hotel, the only place they allowed foreigners to stay. And the numbers grew over the course of weeks. I was back and forth. I went back to Beijing. I went to Shanghai for the ASEAN meeting, where 9/11 was the only topic of conversation and debate, of course. And eventually, I got back to. I went back to, when you're a foreign correspondent, you meet people who are fascinated with certain countries. And I walked into the foreign ministry's office in Tashkent, and the spokesman there was a man called Mr. Umarov, and he was really lovely. And he had a poster on his wall of the Sydney Opera House. And I saw that, and I said, well, of course, Mr. Umarov, you know that I'm from Australia, don't you? And he went, oh, and he told me that the Uzbek authorities were going to allow the journalists in Termez to get onto a barge. We were going to be visaed out, stamped out for a week, and allowed to go on the barge down the Amu Darya and then into Mazar-e Sharif. And this was early October. And so I went back down to Termez, and I told all the journalists who were still there in this same hotel, where it was just a clusterfuck, as we call it, and had been for a while. And sure enough, the next day, the Uzbeks seemed to have been spending their time making arrangements with the Northern Alliance, who had control of still, throughout the Taliban's first regime, held on to control of parts of the north as well as the Panjshir Valley, and they seemed to have done a deal so that we could get on this barge and go down the Amu Darya into Mazar-e Sharif, get bussed down into a hotel, and we did that. A number of us were able to do that, and we got there just in time for the Taliban siege of General Dostum's fort, and for the invasion, the US invasion. There were already US and British special forces there, and there were special forces and CIA, armed CIA, working with the Northern Alliance there in Mazar-e Sharif. And it was a really interesting experience, and it was my first experience of covering war. Yeah, so that's how it started.
That sounds incredible. And what kind of viewpoint did you have on that when it started? I mean, how close to everything were you?
Well, we were right there when Dostum's... Well, what happened was that as we were on the barge going down into Mazar-e Sharif, the barges and the buses, as we were travelling, a German TV crew that had stolen across the Friendship Bridge, which had been closed for many years. The Uzbeks had basically fenced off Afghanistan during the Taliban's 1996 to 2001 regime. but a German TV station had made it in time. Excuse me. And they were there in time for what had become a siege by the time I got there. Taliban prisoners had been brought into Dostum's fort, which is on the outskirts of Mazar-e Sharif, on trucks from other provinces, Talakhan and Badakhshan. And as they had been told that they wouldn't be imprisoned, they certainly weren't going to be handed over to the Americans. We're just going to process you and send you off home, no matter where you came from. And when they got there, they saw that there were these foreigners, albeit dressed in pakuls and shalwar kameez, but speaking Uzbek, speaking Dari, working with the Northern Alliance. And when they saw this, they hadn't been disarmed. And so, up go the shalwar kameez, and out came rocket launch rocket RPGs and AK-47s, and they just went nuts. And they shot some of the foreigners, they shot some of the Northern Alliance, and they took over control of the Khalajangi, which is Dostum's fort there. And I got there in time for this siege, but it had just begun. And I spent a week basically crouched outside the Khalajangi while the Northern Alliance and the Americans tried to kill the Taliban. Yeah. And I was staying in this little hotel. I can't remember the name of the hotel, but, obviously they'd hardly had any customers or guests there for a long time. And I was working on the Australian clock, and Australia is ahead of everybody, and all the other journalists staying in this hotel were working on, British or European or American time, way behind. So I was up at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning on the phone to my editors in Sydney, telling them what was going on. I had a phone, I didn't have a sat phone because I wasn't prepared for any of this. I had a phone that I had hired in Tashkent, so the only place that I could use it was I worked out 1 square foot on the roof of this hotel. So it's the only place I could dictate my copy down the phone. And I was going to tell you something about that. Oh yeah, so we got down there. That's right. So I was in this hotel. The room in the hotel had 2 of these old cots. They were like military cots with all the springs together. And so when you lay on them, it was like being on a waterbed or something. So I put my mattress on the floor so I could at least get some sleep. And very early, just at daybreak one morning, it must have been the 2nd or 3rd morning that I had been there, I woke up to this enormous bang, and I sat bolt upright, and I've never done that before or since, bolt upright, and looked out of the full length windows of my hotel room, and I could see a mushroom cloud in the distance. Where I was about 15 kilometres away from the Khalajangi, Dostum's fort, and the Americans had fired an ICBM into the middle of the fort. And of course it's all dust up there, dry, dusty. This is October, so the snows and the rains haven't come yet. And it was just this enormous mushroom cloud. It was an astounding sight. So of course I got up and rushed down there, and the Afghans, a lot of them were, exiled Northern Alliance leaders. I remember meeting Abdullah, for instance, and who later became the putative vice president, prime minister, whatever title it was that President Ghani wouldn't allow him to have. Chief executive, that's what he was, yeah. But I went down there. All these officials were saying, oh, yeah, it's all over there. We've got it. It's all done and dusted, but don't go. It's not safe. So, of course, I went down there. Yeah. It's very early in the morning, still cold. The sun hadn't burnt the cloud off yet, and I went in and I walked around the Khalajangi, and there were dead horses and donkeys and dogs, and there were men who had clearly been cut down as they had been running. There'd be half a man just lying or half a man diagonally or horizontally or whatever. It was really quite a scene, but because it was still cold, and it was too early for any rot to set in. There was no smell. I never had any sort of flashbacks or nightmares about it, and I think the reason for that is because there was just no smell. There weren't even any flies buzzing around, but it was quite a scene. And then it turned out that the Taliban, who were still alive, were in the basement of the Kalajangi, and so they filled the Americans and the Northern Alliance filled the basements with freezing cold water to get the Taliban to come out, and shot them as they came out. I shouldn't be laughing, it's terrible, but it was quite a thing to see. It was quite something. Yeah, and so that was my first experience of war, of the horror of war. Yeah.
That is a lot. And how long did you stay, in Afghanistan to witness all of this going on, in that early time?
The Uzbeks gave us a week. People that they stamped out said, if you are not back in a week, you will not be allowed to get back. And so I went back. I took the barge back to Termez, flew back to Tashkent, and then back to China. I can't remember whether ASEAN was before or after that. I think maybe after that. I can't remember. But yeah, so then I went back to China. Yeah, and there were some people who decided not to go back, who stayed in and then went south for what was going to happen in Kabul. But I went back.
Okay, and what about, so you've just left this war zone, you've had your first taste of, war reporting. What was it like then returning to Beijing and covering daily things? I mean, how quickly did you decide that Afghanistan was something you wanted to report more on, and when was your next time that you went back?
Well, the decision wasn't so much to cover Afghanistan, it was to cover war. I might sound callous to say it, but I enjoyed the experience because I had been covering China for a decade, I think, by then. And when you're covering a place like China, which is formulaic, where there's very tight controls, where the access to information from outside was starting to close down, it becomes almost like a script, and you know what's coming next, what the big next set piece is going to be, which anniversary is it, of the Communist Party's 40th or 50th or whatever anniversary. And it was fascinating and wonderful covering China, and it was always in demand. My editors always wanted it, and the economy was developing, and I'd done specializations for Reuters when I worked for them, and so I had loved it. But I liked the unpredictable dynamism of the war, and the reporting was much more raw. And my reports were where I went, what I did, who I met, what they said, and why. And I thought that I liked the adrenaline of it as well. And so I left my job as China correspondent at the end of that year, excuse me, and I moved to Istanbul because it had become pretty clear that Iraq was going to be the next target of the Americans, and Istanbul was close enough. I could fly to Diyarbakir and then basically drive to Iraq from there, which is what I did, a few months later.
Wow, you had a front row seat to so much of what went on in those early years. And I hate to say, for me, I was in middle school when 9/11 happened, so I missed so much of those early years, the basic facts, but I just can't imagine what that would have been like to see firsthand. I would love to be able to hear more. I know some people who would probably love to interview you about your Iraq experience too, because they still care so much about what happened there. And I mean, well, I did
write a book. I wrote a book about Iraq. We can give it a plug. It's called High Tea in Mosul, the true story of two English women in war-torn Iraq. So anybody who's interested in what I did in Iraq can find my book.
I'm adding it to my list, and I'll be telling my friend Will Selber is he had some very interesting deployments to Iraq, and I am sure he's going to want to get talking to you about that as well. So when then was it 2009 when you transitioned back to Afghanistan? Because obviously that is the time when we started shifting away from Iraq. Is that why you shifted back to Afghanistan, or did you kind of cover both zones in that interim, that 8-year? It's a rather large period.
Yeah, it is a large. It is large. I went all over Europe and North Africa chasing jihadis. And then I worked, then I settled in London for a little while, and then I moved back to Hong Kong, worked for the AFP, Agence France Presse, and they asked me to go to Kabul as the bureau chief. And I was a little bit reluctant at first, and after my bosses talked to me about it and asked me if I wanted to go, I realised that it coincided with Barack Obama, who was President of the United States, of course. He had called it the Good War. And it dawned on me, and this was in late 2008 that this conversation came up I was living in Hong Kong. And I thought, if Barack Obama is calling it the Good War, actually it was early 2009, then this is going to be at the top of the news agenda for the foreseeable future. And basically what I thought was that it would be an American priority. And even at that time, I hadn't realized that it had become, I don't think it was as hot as it was to become, but it was a hot war. And so I thought, this could really propel me back onto the front pages. And when you're with a newswire, of course, it's front pages all over the world, not just your newspaper. And I like working for the wires for that reason. And so I decided that I would go. And so in 2009, I took up the position as bureau chief based in Kabul for Agence France Presse, and I did that for a couple of years. And it really was as I had expected, and which was the reason I took the job. It became the headline of the world, for the whole time I was there. And we had a really good bureau. We had Afghan reporters and photographers who were just such great guys, fantastic at what they did. One of them, Masood Hosseini, I've worked with him for more than a decade, maybe 15 years now. And getting on to 15 years, he went on to win a Pulitzer Prize while he was still at AFP. Sardar Ahmed, another very good friend of mine and colleague, he was killed by the Taliban along with his whole family while they had Persian New Year dinner at the Serena Hotel in Kabul. Marai was killed. He was also a photographer there. He was killed a few years later. I think 2017 he was killed in a suicide bombing, in a secondary attack actually, aimed at first responders and journalists in central Kabul. AFP had a pretty hard time. After I had left, I'm glad to say I was able to keep my people safe. And then in 2014, is that right? 2014, I went back with Associated Press as the bureau chief then. And that's when ISIS was really at its peak in Iraq and Syria. So we didn't dominate, but Afghanistan was still very hot, and it did punch above its weight on a regular basis. So I would say that I covered Afghanistan at its hottest and its biggest. Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, 2009-10 is the time of the surge. So obviously everyone was hoping that we would turn the tides on that war. And 2014 is the year after I left the intelligence community. And, the Taliban, we had started negotiating with them in Qatar. And that obviously stirred the pot. And then we'd stopped. And so what was your sense about those years and where, the NATO forces were in terms of bringing this sense of stability back? Because obviously if your memories are also these great journalists and photographers being killed by the Taliban, right? And that's something that we still see today, and it has been happening for many years. It's you had a unique view on that, and I'd like to hear more about your perspective on how the country was developing and how that NATO assistance force was doing in terms of bringing democracy.
Yeah, that's a very complex question, Beth. And as you know, you were there, it was a very complex situation. I never lived inside the green zone. My bureaus were always outside, so I never felt that I had any restrictions on where I could go, how I could move, within sensible parameters. Of course, we were able to move freely, and I really appreciated being able to do that. Also, even though I was with French media, I still got a lot of access to American, British assets, if you like. Any helicopter trip going anywhere, I was on it. Bit of a helicopter whore, and the same at AP, because it was a great way to see the country. There are a lot of different ways of looking at what was going on. The United States pumped $1 billion into developing media between 2010 and 2015. And that made an astounding difference to the way people viewed themselves and the world and the war and the Taliban, including, as you might remember, television series where the policeman was the star, and there was so much development going on, but there was also so much free money. And I remember that soon, within days of me arriving, one of my colleagues at AFP, this is in 2009, Wahid Masood, his name is, and he remains a close friend. He said, "Come on, get in the car, we'll go for a drive." And he drove me around Kabul and showed me the city. And I remember thinking, because of the contrast that I saw, the men in wearing sandals pulling carts of garbage behind them, and the open drains down both sides of the street, and the piles of garbage, and the rabid dogs, and then the private cars and the military convoys that were all over. And I just remember thinking, this is probably one of the most corrupt places I've ever been. And I think at that stage, even having spent such a long time in China, which of course is incredibly corrupt, prove me wrong, I thought that the corruption was there for me to see. And nothing in my experience over subsequent years veered me from that belief. And I was also able to see the development of media people. When you first get something new, like journalists, they learned how to be journalists and they love being journalists. And, Afghan people have a very deep sense of justice and fairness and what's right, whether they do it or not. But, and so I think a perception and a concept of free media found very fertile ground. But over the course of subsequent years, after hundreds of television and radio stations and newspapers and magazines had been established with grant money, basically, and people who called themselves media moguls sort of, glommed onto that and set up private TV stations and whatever. When people in positions of power realised the power of media, that's when journalists started to be targeted, and they were targeted by corrupt businessmen, black mafia, military people who were powerful but didn't want their nefarious behaviour exposed, and journalists started to become very vulnerable. So that was another thing, and the wholesale theft of millions and millions of dollars worth of development money, which you would have seen, and suddenly you've got people driving Lamborghinis, and buying their own Humvees. We saw this, and the old houses being pulled down, and these horrid things we call poppy palaces with the bathroom tiles on the outside being built to the very edges of blocks of land and rented out to NGOs, charity organisations or whoever for $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 a month. It was just a cash free-for-all, and it was very disappointing. So there were very many things that I saw. I went to very many places. My friend and colleague, who I mentioned before, Masood Hosseini, photographer, and I went on. We went around the country to work on a series of stories about Afghan women. It's easy to forget, given what's going on in Afghanistan now, that Afghanistan, was regularly voted the worst place in the world to be born female, and that was throughout the 20 years of the Republic as well. And so I found it, when I first moved to Afghanistan, very difficult to grasp, let alone sympathise or empathise with women living the way they're forced to, and are now forced to. My understanding is a little more profound now, of course, but Masood and I, like I said, we travelled around the country to do this series that I found very. It had a great impact on me, learning what women put up with, how they were forced to live, what circumstances they had to deal with every day. And I think that is probably one of the most important and profound lessons that I learned while I was there. And, it was an eye roll for me before, Laura Bush and Hillary Clinton, we're going in there to free the women. It's like, oh yeah, well, how bad can it be? And I went and I saw how bad I thought it could be. And I talked to women about how much worse it had been for them under the Taliban's first regime. And now we are seeing just how much worse even than that it has become. And I think we both got an idea, Beth, that it can only get worse.
Oh, 100%. Every time I think that it can't get worse, it does. And
it does.
I think it'd be worth it to talk about the difficult things, because I know I've seen some of those things in that women had to deal with in the interim still. And, you have high suicide rates because women, when they, get brought into a new home situation with a new husband, they are subject to poor treatment from the husband as well as their new mother-in-law and whomever else around the house wants to crap on them. And so you have high rates of attempted self-immolation, of, just there's the pressure and the maltreatment that women endure. There's also the, there was the high maternal mortality rate that we did decrease that over time, but it's not like giving birth over here, which still it can't be, for some groups of people, it's still not safe to give birth in the US. But in Afghanistan, it's even different. And I'd love to hear about what else you saw on that trip that gave you that new perspective.
Well, we did go to Herat, where in Herat City there is a hospital that has a ward just for girls who self-immolate. And even many of them will be brought in with third-degree burns from having poured, fuel on themselves and set it alight. And many of them will say, no, I didn't. It was an accident. I didn't do it on purpose, because they've survived it. And the doctor said, we always know, because one arm, the arm they used to pour the fuel on them, is not burned. And that was a real sort of like eye-opener, for me. Masood knew about it. We talked to these girls, and there was another place, I think we went up to one of the northern cities, and we went into a shelter and talked to women who were in this shelter, escaping domestic abuse. We went to a prison where girls were locked up because they left home. I want to get away from home. I want to have my own life. I'd like it if my brothers, my father, my whatever stopped beating me and raping me, so I'm leaving. And they'd get picked up, some of them trying to check into hostels or hotels or just on the road, not knowing where they were, and they would be put in prison. It's amazing stuff. The level of, it is abuse, at every level, the levels of abuse that they are. We met a woman who'd won a seat in Parliament. She'd run against her husband and she beat him, and he beat the shit out of her, It was just, everything was just so beyond comprehension. So, and the series of stories that we did, Masood took the pictures, I did the words. We won an Amnesty Human Rights Award for the series. So it seemed to have had some impact, at least. Yeah.
I am going to be looking for that. I think it's just so important because, especially right now, right? We know that happened as a result of those 5 years that the Taliban held power, how hard it was to pull themselves back out after that. And now we've let them have, going on 3+ years. And we've seen what's happening to these women. And, there are now, I think that the internet has helped because we know where some of the problems are. We're able to try to help some people escape if things are getting bad in very limited cases. And, the Taliban can't strangle all the media because there are people like all the journalists for 8 a.m. media still spreading the truth. But imagine what they're going to have to deal with. Afghan women, I hear it. No one is belittled more than Afghan women, I feel.
But that's the thing. They are Afghan women and they are categorised as such. And so I think, at first I got a little bit annoyed that there were no loud voices in the feminist community from the West speaking up. This is not. And then I realised that American women are fighting for their own physical autonomy and reproductive rights and independence over who they are. So, what you've got is a situation where the extremes are becoming normalised. And so the parameters of what is acceptable as normal behaviour and treatment, behaviour of and by and towards and treatment of women are narrowing, and all of those things that our mothers and aunties and grandmas fought for us to have, and for not only for women of my age and your age, but younger than us, they're all being traded away because there is a generational lack of awareness of how hard they were to come by just in the last 100 years in the first place. And I think that's what we're seeing. The world is ruled by men, largely white, middle-class, middle-aged, mediocre white men. And they want to hold on to the power that they've got. And so it's an eye roll for them even now that women in Afghanistan, oh, come on, Imran Khan, who was the Prime Minister that everybody of Pakistan, who everybody in the cricket playing world loves because he was a world-class cricketer, he came out after the Taliban took over Afghanistan and congratulated them along with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, and then a little while later said, they never send their girls to school anyway, so what's the big deal? It's like, hello, you've got an English ex-wife and 2 English sons, and oh, by the way, he just applied this year to become the Chancellor of Oxford University. I mean, the chutzpah of the man, but that's what you're up against.
Yeah, it's systemic, and right, when your rights are under attack, you don't have the ability to spread that. It's a very difficult time to be a woman right now.
Yeah,
and that's
it
why
is.
I think we need angry women's voices to remind us, just like you said, this is something that was fought for. And there's no one I know who's fighting harder right now than Afghan women. I mean, they're out in the streets, even though that they know that what might happen to them is that they might be imprisoned,
killed,
and raped, which is something killed, raped, impregnated, forced to have abortions, just a horrid panoply of possible events that can happen. So I want to get there with you too, because I know you've covered that with help from the journalists at 8 a.m. and been able to raise that up to, Richard Bennett.
Yeah.
And I think that's
and then
amazing.
Look what happened to him. I wrote about him and they banned him,
Oh, yes. Well, of course they were going to do that. They can't let anybody see what's happening. Exactly. I don't know. Maybe it's as much of a kick for... Well, let's get there after we talk about it. So
Okay.
Before that, you were on the last commercial flight out of Afghanistan on August 15th, 2021. Why were you there at that time? Were you there to cover what was going to be the end? And how did you end up on that? Tell me about that part of your story.
Well, we had, the world was locked down in 2020, and as soon as we were allowed, and I live in London, and so of course I was locked down here, and as soon as we were able to fly again, I got on a plane and I went back. That deal that was signed between Donald Trump when he was president and the Taliban, who he dealt with bilaterally, totally sidelining the Afghan government and the Afghan people, basically sealed the deal. And so, by which I mean sealed the deal for the Taliban to return to power. And I wrote a lot about that at the time. That deal was signed on the 29th of February 2020, and just less than a week before that, I think, the New York Times ran an editorial that was signed by Sirajuddin Haqqani, and it failed to take note of the fact that he is the head of the Haqqani network, one of the most brutal terrorist outfits in the country, that he was blacklisted by the United Nations Security Council as a terrorist, that he was also not only a deputy leader of the Taliban, which they did nicely put in fine print under his name, but also a leader of Al-Qaeda. So there was a lot of apologia going on. We were hearing from military leaders of all nationalities and NATO leaders saying, oh, it's a different Taliban, we can do business with them now. And that lady who still runs UNAMA, Rosa Ozabayev, I think her name is pronounced.
Lord. Yes.
Oh, yeah, but they're just country boys. They're just boys from the country. They were, I mean, yes, it was all really quite astonishing, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And so I got on a plane and I went back to Kabul, and Masood and I got the band back together. And by then we were both freelancing, and so we didn't have to ask anybody's permission to go and cover stories that we wanted to cover. We could just decide where the story was and get on a plane or get in a car and go. So we were very, very free to do coverage, and we really went to a lot of places and did some quite explosive coverage. One night we were in Balkh. We were chased across wheat fields by moonlight by a Taliban ambush brigade firing at us. That was pretty hairy. I didn't think that they were coming for us, certainly not me. We were with the governor of a district, this rather wonderful woman called Salima Mazari. She's about 6 feet tall, and she ran the militia there, and she and her husband lived in this ramshackle little house where everything was powered off one battery, one 9-volt battery. It was hilarious. And we had spent the day with her watching people come in and report to her, and then we went out and checked all the frontline positions with her, overlooking the Taliban positions, and then in the evening, as it was getting darker, Masood said, they want us to stay the night. And I'm like, I don't know whether that's a good idea, security. Like, what do you think? He said, why not? And I thought, well, Masood knows what he's talking about here, so yeah, why not? And within an hour, she and her husband left the room to take a call. She came back in and said, put your boots back on and follow me outside, but don't look alarmed. And I'm thinking, why would we look alarmed? And we went outside around the back of the building, climbed up a wadi onto a path that went through a wheat field, and we started hiking through this wheat field. Nice moonlit night, no clouds. And then the gunfire started behind us. And we were chased for hours. And we ended up in the house of, like a 3-building village, miles and miles away, where we were taken in by an elderly man. And I was standing in the courtyard trying to get another place. We were in the middle of nowhere, no signal on the phone. I was trying to get a signal on the phone, and the only way, it was pitch black, of course, because there was not much electricity, and the only reason I knew there was a horse in this courtyard was because I could smell him, and calling a friend of mine who was with the Ministry of Interior, saying, well, I think if you can pick up our coordinates, this is where we are. And I gave the phone to Masood. He said, let me speak to Masood. Gave the phone to Masood, and I could hear him screaming at Masood. What are you doing there? Why are you there at this time of night? What made you think it was okay to take Lynne there, stand out a bit? And the next day we got through the night and we went back, and we ended up back in, through a circuitous stories that we don't have time for now, back in Mazar-i-Sharif in this hotel where we were staying, and 2 of Masood's mates, a poet and a musician, came over. So we're sitting in this room. They're drinking vodka out of those cans that we get olive oil in, and Masood and I, he's editing his photos and I'm writing my story, and every now and then they would say, Miss Lynne, what do you think about your job? And I would say, oh, I love my job. It beats working for a living, get back to him. Half an hour later, Miss Lynne, what do you think about what happened to you last night? And I said, oh my goodness, Miss Mazari is just such a brave woman, and she is lucky to be alive. And they said, no, it wasn't Miss Mazari that they were after, it was you. And I said, oh no, it wasn't. Texted my friend at the MOI who had shouted the night before down the line at Masood and said, oh, these guys are sitting here drinking vodka telling me that I was the target of that ambush attempt last night. And he said, yes, of course you were. What do you think the propaganda value would have been in getting a blonde, high-profile war correspondent either kidnapped or killed? We heard the chatter. And I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea I was so important, So we got a great story out of that, as you can imagine. And then the other really, really impactful story that we got, and I think it was probably the best story that we got while we were there in the 4 months that we were covering the whole thing, was a trip we made to Bamiyan. And we were originally going to go into Maidan Wardak, which is the neighbouring province, and join a kind of like a dissident Hazara militia there. And the guy who was the head of this militia had been accused of shooting an Afghan army helicopter out of the sky, and he had denied it. And we kind of looked into it, and we went to visit people in Maidan Wardak who knew about this, and we came away thinking, he probably did do it, so we didn't want to, we were going to ride on horses or donkeys through the mountains and the forest to his encampment, and we decided not to do that. So we went back to Bamiyan city and we interviewed the governor, and the governor said to us, there is a valley in the centre of the province where the Taliban came in and they took it over for 4 days. There's no Afghan army presence in Bamiyan. It was only local militia and armed police. So the police were basically doing the army's job for them on front lines all over the province. And during the 4 days that the Taliban had been in this valley, the town was called Saigon. They had issued edicts via the mosques ordering that every family, every household make a list of all the women and girls, all the females, if you like, in each house and hand it to the mosque, because the women were going to be forced to marry Taliban fighters as rewards for them winning the war. Mm-hmm. And so this edict went out and every woman in Saigon fled. They either ran or drove or put a suitcase in a wheelbarrow and pushed it out of there. There were no women left. And then the militia pushed the Taliban out. So they were in for like 4 days, maybe 5 days. I'm pretty sure it was 4 days. And then the local militia, with the help of the police, pushed them out again. And so it was free. So we said to the governor, can this be true? And he said, yeah, I've been there and talked to them. And then he gave a speech from the mosque on the Friday. And he told them, and people there we talked to, they knew about it as well, and they were so furious about it, as you can imagine. And so we got in a police convoy, thanks to the governor, and we drove to Saigon, which is really another place where, you know, no phone signal, nothing, just the middle of nowhere. This very strange little city where there were shops, ramshackle shops on either side of a white concrete road. And the concrete was white, and fashions in Afghanistan that year for the men were brightly coloured shalwar kameez and waistcoats. So all of the muted and embroidered stuff was out, and the made in Pakistan, probably made in China stuff was in. So all of the men were wearing different coloured shalwar kameez and with different combinations of shirt and trousers, and then coloured contrasting waistcoats. It was astounding, and all the colours were like cinnamon and chocolate and pistachio and raspberry. It was, and my photographs from that the white road and all these men and boys in these in this kaleidoscope of coloured clothing. It was just fantastic. And we went into, you know, we like the Pied Piper really. We were walking down the middle of the road, gathering people behind us. And we went into a little shop and we talked to the man behind the counter about this experience that they'd had. And of course, other people came into the shop and it was all confirmed. And this guy said to us, one of the guys who came in was a mathematics teacher, and he said, would you like to come? My wife is back, and my sister and my sister-in-law, they've come back. Would you like to come round and meet them? And so we went to their home and we did this amazing story on video, you know, audio recording, photographs, notes, you name it. And they were all, you know, tickety-boo about it, and everybody had the same story. So it was doubtless true. Mm-hmm. So we went back to Bamiyan City and we filed this story, and we were writing principally at this stage for Foreign Policy magazine. And Foreign Policy gave this such a wonderful spread with fantastic use of Masood's photos and great copy, fabulous headline. My editor there, Keith Johnson, was just such a superb person to work with, and he really saw the value in everything that I did, and Masood's photos, of course. And Masood likes to describe this story as like a bomb. He said it's like we dropped a bomb on the Taliban. They went nuts. The pushback was astounding, and the trolling and the threats, and we were both elevated to a high value target status as a result of this. If we hadn't been before, now we knew about it. And it really confirmed rumours that had been coming out of parts of Afghanistan where, you remember, they took the country from the inside out. They closed all the border points and customs points, and then they started taking districts around rural provincial cities, and it was very methodical. It was really quite something to witness and see and analyse and see what they were doing. But this was before they took any provincial capital, so it's concentrating on the districts. And there were rumours coming from districts that media organisations were being closed down, journalists were being forced to leave, stay home, go into hiding, whatever, and women were being forced into marriages, which is essentially sex slavery, which is what we called it. Mm-hmm. What we were able to do with this story is confirm that that's exactly what they were doing and what their plan was for, the rest of the country. It was huge. And the other story, if you want me to carry on.
Oh, yes, I do. Absolutely.
And this will answer your initial question of how did we come to be on the last flight out in a long, circuitous way. We went to Herat because Ismail Khan, one of the old warlords, had come out of retirement, and he had pulled his militia together, and he'd been seen on the news jogging. He was 72 at the time, jogging across the Pashtun Bridge in Herat with his militia behind him in his little white shalwar kameez and his signature black and white turban and his beard, long white beard. The last time we'd interviewed him, he'd combed it before we took his photograph. Anyway, so we thought, and the whole country went, "Oh, thank God, Ismail Khan's going to save us." This is the level of desperation. So we flew into Herat, and we flew into a road closure. We spent 4 hours waiting at the airport for the road from the airport into town to reopen because the Taliban were rocketing it, and they also did that on a regular basis at the airport. So the airport and the road were closed just after we arrived. We eventually got to our hotel, we dropped our stuff, we put our flak jackets on, and we went out to where Ismail Khan had made camp on the banks of the river there that runs around the edge of Herat. He had a sandbagged and HESCO-bagged compound, and outside it there were armed NDS, intelligence service guys, and his own militia, all in their own mufti. And we requested an interview with him, and we hung around outside and talked to people and looked at their weaponry and took photos, and we were starting to get bored. And, and then to break the boredom, these militia guys turned up shouting, "Look what we've got, look what we've got." And they were banging on the gate of Ismail Khan's compound to try and get in because they had two guys with them wearing white that they said were Taliban that they had found in a nearby house. And so what the Taliban were doing was they were going forward and coming back and going forward. They would leave snipers in the buildings. And these two guys had been found apparently as snipers. One of them was older with short salt and pepper hair, and the other one was younger. We were told they were father and son with long hair. And Ismail Khan wouldn't open the gate. So the militia beat these guys to death in front of us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That had to be really... What was that like to see?
Oh, it was horrific. It was just absolutely horrific. These guys were beaten with fists and feet and butts of guns and you name it, until they were no longer men in white shalwar kameez. They were lumps of red, and the bodies were thrown into the streets into the street. We were on a street. And the guys in the militia shot their guns in the air. Allahu Akbar. They got onto their walkie-talkies to tell whoever else, the militia groups, Allahu Akbar. And left the bodies there for the dogs. And about half an hour later, Ismail, the gates opened and Ismail Khan came out and he just did a little bit of a walk around and he pretended not to look at these lumps of red former men in the street, and he took a phone call and he turned around and walked back into his compound, and one of his guys motioned to me and to Masood and said, "Come on in." So we went inside and I interviewed him, and then Masood took his photo as he prayed. And that night, Herat was under curfew, so as soon as it was dark, the entire city was black. Everybody stayed home, and you could see the firefights. We were in a hotel. We were on the 6th floor of a lovely little Persian hotel, and we had made a newsroom in the lobby as you came out of the lift, full wall of windows, and you could see the fighting. And we'd go up and sit on the roof and have a cigarette and watch the fighting. And one evening, we were only going to be there for 2 days, but because of the airport closures and the rocketing of the airport and the airport road, we ended up trapped basically for 5 days. And I said to Masood, pointing out the window at the firefights going on, I said, we're essentially watching Herat fall. And after Herat falls, Kandahar will fall, and after Kandahar and Helmand are gone, Kabul will fall. You've got a visa to Holland. You have to work out what you're going to do with it. And he said that his visa expired on the 31st of August. So we arrived on the 2nd of August in Herat, and so we were there for 5 days. So this is somewhere in between there. Maybe the 5th, let's say the 5th. We were having this conversation. He said, my visa expires, flick, 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 31st of August. But you can't arrive in a country, a day before your visa expires. You have to look as if you actually want to be there, right? And so we decided we'd give it 2 weeks, and when we got back to Kabul, we'd go to Turkish Airlines and get tickets for the 15th. 15th? Yeah, okay, 15th. Now, I had a ticket out on the 9th of September because I thought everything was going to go belly up on the symbolic 11th of September. Oh, wow. And so we went to Turkish Airlines and there was nobody there. A big, like everything, a big house behind a high wall with a garden, and we just walked straight in, and he bought a ticket for the 15th. I changed mine for the 15th. And a couple of days later, he took a friend of his to Turkish Airlines. So this would have been, we did this around the 7th or the 8th or the 9th. Pretty soon, and I have a list of all the dates still I look at now and then, of the dates that the provincial capitals started to fall. Mm-hmm. And they started to fall while we were still in Herat, but these big ones still hadn't fallen. But anyone with half a brain could see that it was going to happen. But people were flooding into Kabul from all over the country to escape the fighting and to escape the Taliban, where places had already fallen. And so the banks were overwhelmed. The ATMs, even in supermarkets, were overwhelmed. Bottled water was running out. Every spare room in every hotel, hostel, whatever, was full. People were starting to camp in the parks. The Sharanau Park in central Kabul was now full. We were driving through town by the Sharanau Park is on one side, and there's the cinema, and there's the mosque, and then the Kabul Business Centre, and whatever else. And outside the park, there was a small truck that had come in with relief for the people who were essentially now refugees in their own country, camping. And there was an elderly man and a young boy fighting over a carpet. They were pulling it between them. And Masood and I are in the car, and we just saw this and we thought, oh my God, And around about this time, he took a friend of his to Turkish Airlines to get a ticket. He said, "You've got to get a ticket. Let's go." Mm-hmm. And when he got there were 1,000 people at Turkish. You couldn't get a ticket out. So then this is in the last week, right? It's just getting, and the traffic wasn't moving. And, you know, the traffic in Kabul, as you will know, Beth, it was always bad, right? But people sort of like got on with it, right? They just stuck in the traffic, yeah, okay, make phone calls, do whatever. People were white-knuckled around their steering wheels because nothing was moving and they were terrified and they didn't know what was going to happen. The 12th of August was a Thursday. Ismail Khan was captured that day, and the Taliban posted photographs online of him. He was captured or surrendered or whatever the deal was. And on that evening, Masood and I decided that we would go to an Italian restaurant just inside the green zone for our last dinner. And this is the 12th. And this place was called Boccaccio's, and it had been there forever, and the quality of the food was fabulous. It never changed. I always used to have the spaghetti con vongole and a glass of red wine. And we went in and always had these lovely ladies working there for them who would come from Uzbekistan, and they wouldn't leave that building for 2 or 3 years, make a lot of money, go home and open a hairdressing salon with their mums, right? And they were always lovely. And had hair down their back, and they were great. This lady came up and said, "What would you like to drink?" I said, "I'll have a glass of red wine," because it was always, "What have you got?" We've got both kinds of wine, red and white, right? So I'll have a glass of red, please. "Oh, we haven't got any. We've run out of red wine." And I thought, "Oh my God, Boccaccio's has run out of red wine. I'll have a glass of white then, please." "No, we've got no white wine." Oh, okay, so something's going on. Like all the border points had been closed, right? So supplies were running out. So Masood and I, things were really getting tough. We thought we had to drink gin and tonics with our pasta. And she brought our pasta to the table, and Masood said to her, "You know, things are really getting a bit serious out there. What are your plans?" And she said, "Well, the NDS came around to us the other day and said that we should leave. So I've got a flight to take me home on Tuesday." That was in about 5 days. So on the Friday evening, we had invited a bunch of people around for just for drinks and a get-together. Half of them didn't come because they were worried. The security situation had deteriorated and people were now starting to figure out what they were going to do and how they were going to get out. On the Saturday, I was reporting for the BBC and other NPR and other television networks, and I was being asked, what should people do? And I've looked back at these and I look very concerned because it was a very serious situation, but you don't remember later how seriously you took it, right? And I was saying people really now have to consider what they're going to do. NPR asked me if I wanted to stay for a month and cover it. And I thought, a siege is probably the worst thing that you could cover, because the only story is going to be how much worse it is today than it was yesterday, and how much less supplies, water and food there's going to be tomorrow. So I decided I didn't want to do that. And on the Saturday, I wrote something for the New Statesman, a magazine, and it was like a diary. And I said, I look back on that as well later, and said, as I write, there are rumours that the president is preparing to leave the country. People I knew who worked in the presidential palace were saying that the shredding machines were working overtime, and that most people had already left. Even the vice president, Amrullah Saleh, they didn't know where he was. There were rumours that he'd gone to the Panjshir, and where he was from, where his base was, and where Ahmad Masood was. And then, bless their hearts, the people at NPR offered Masood and I a secure ride to the airport, and they picked us up on very early, like 6 a.m., before 6 a.m. on the Sunday morning. And we drove to the airport through an empty city. You will remember what a fortified place Kabul was. Every couple of 100 meters there was an army checkpoint, and your car was stopped and, searched, and the back was opened up, etc. So all of that gone. And Masood's family compound was out on the outskirts of town, and he said they were awake all night listening to the gunfire, the weapons fire all night. And his brother drove him to where I was that morning, 100 k's an hour. Let's get through this. We went to the airport, and it was just so solemn, but there was no panic at the airport. It felt like everybody there had tickets and still queuing up, checking in, going through security. But when we got into the waiting lounge, there were some faces there that we hadn't expected to see, and that was also a sign that people were hedging their bets. And we flew to Istanbul, and we got off the plane 5 or 6 hours later, however long that flight is, and turned on our iPhones and learned that it was all over.
Oh gosh, what was that feeling like?
Well, for Masood and I, very, very different, I didn't have a dog in that fight. He'd left his family behind, and his family are very, very prominent people, and Shia. And so it was quite... And it was his country, His country had been lost. We'd watched the evacuation. For people to say that, the evacuation was Biden's fault is just to not have a clue what the hell happened there. When I got there in May, there were only 2,500 US soldiers left, and we spent an afternoon at a friend's place sitting on Wazir Akbar Khan Hill on his roof, watching the helicopters go from the US Embassy to the airport, the US Embassy to the airport, just like that. It was unbelievable. Every possible, the Chinooks, the Black Hawk, they were all doing it. And then, the lights were turned off at Bagram on the weekend of 4th of July, and the American military left without even telling their Afghan counterparts that they were going. So it was the military that screwed up that evacuation, without any doubt in my mind. The administration was let down. And I'm sorry to say that, but I saw that. That was true. And it was Trump who signed the deal, and he pushed that evacuation to be done as fast as it possibly could be done. So there's a lot more people involved in that than the automatic head shaking and all of that bullshit about America left, $80 million worth of, or $5 billion, whatever amount of arms and ammunition behind. That equipment, material had been transferred to the Afghan army because America spent $80 billion building the Afghan military, and they left it behind. It's very convenient for them to hear people say America, left all this equipment behind. No, they didn't. The Afghan forces left that equipment behind. They abandoned that equipment. So, let's get it right.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's anyone who wants to blame one person or one entity on what happened, that's
politicize it, for their own purposes.
False. Absolutely.
Exactly.
There is blame that goes
everywhere.
It's a huge blast of blame, and it makes me sad when people say that, because they really don't, I think, understand the complexity.
Yes.
We never
you're right.
understood the complexity of it all.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
So
and the other thing is that, I was talking about the corruption earlier. One of the entities that really has to be blamed is the Afghan authorities at every level, civilian and military and judicial, parliamentary. The corruption was just unsustainable. And I have had thoughts about, while we were waiting for President Biden to make the decision of whether to stick to that Trump deal and leave, or maybe even leave a small footprint behind, I reread Obama's Wars. What's the name of the guy who wrote it, the former Washington Post? Ben Bradley? No, is it? I can't remember. Anyway, I reread Obama's Wars, and there's a section in that about the decision-making process around the surge, which you mentioned before. Biden didn't want a big military footprint. He's not a big military footprint person. He's not a nation builder. He wasn't into that. So I thought, okay, it could go that he leaves 1,500 troops there just as a hold on to Bagram and have a presence that may prove to be a warning, a sign to the Taliban, you don't come in, behave yourselves, form part of the government, which is what the deal was about, blah, blah, or he'll just go. And I think I made up my mind that he would probably go. And so unlike most people who were office holders in the Afghan government and military, I was not surprised when he made the decision to go.
Yeah, it felt to me that we just wanted to get out from pretty much the moment that I started in the intelligence community in 2010,
goodness.
Was just, and it was, how can we manufacture that with the least amount of, and I think people just, the political appetite for staying, there were so many things, but the tragedy is that all of this impacts Afghans. Like you talk about the corruption. I had Brent Huffman, the documentarian, come on a couple weeks ago to talk about saving Mez Aynak, and all these Afghan archaeologists who are just trying to preserve history, who now are being attacked by the Taliban and have to leave the country. But meanwhile, the mines officials were making millions of dollars and building these, the poppy mansions that you talk about, right? The Afghan people have really been let down by so many different, so much. But I think that could just be its own devastating. It should be many devastating stories, actually. There are many people who deserve to have their stories listened to, who, have just been let down a lot. But the story I want to hear so much from you, you've written this story that is like a bomb to the Taliban, 100%. I still remember when your story came out about the women being forced into marriage. Oh my gosh, yes. Thanks, because you knew. I mean, I knew. I was looking for everything. I wanted to know exactly what was going on, and I knew it would be bad for women. And yours was the first voice to explain just how bad it was going to be, I think. So you, knowing that you've been chased across a field because you are you, and you've written these reports that have very much painted the reality of what the Taliban are doing, you still decided to travel back to Afghanistan. And I just want to know, did you have any inkling of what was going to come when you did that?
I knew it was possible.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's knowing it doesn't make the reality any less of a shock when it happens, right? Masood, he knew. There were some friends of mine who said, "Oh yeah, go," because I think they wanted me to be the canary in the mine shaft. And I'm talking about Afghan men, who should have known, who probably did know, but they wanted to see what happened. And I think there was also a level of thinking that nothing really seriously bad would happen to me because I'm a Western high-profile journalist woman, So maybe that's how they were thinking. Masood was really worried, and a couple of my girlfriends in the UK and in Australia said, "Please don't go." And I said, "Well, I've kind of made up my mind now, so I'm going to go." And I wanted to do a series of stories of what it was like now that the Taliban had taken over. And there was still a feeling that foreign correspondents were able to go. You remember that incredible rush of excitement that followed the fall of the Republic, and the Taliban were, their no-go zones were now go zones. And so journalists and camera people and photographers went all over the country to places that they hadn't been able to go before. And, they were like kids in a candy store. But there hadn't been any indication that foreign journalists were going to be subjected to the same sort of restrictions as Afghan journalists were already experiencing. So I didn't have any precedent to follow, and a lot of international news organisations were preparing to send people in for the first anniversary. News people love an anniversary, right? And 1 year ago today, that sort of bullshit. And so that was my plan. And I, of course, still had friends there, and people who I had worked with, and I felt like it was an okay thing to do. I had a place to stay. I booked that I knew and had been to before, and I thought it would be okay. And so I got a visa from the Afghan embassy in London, which now has been closed for the last couple of months. And when I went to pick it up, they handed me an affidavit to sign that I took all the risks associated with going to Afghanistan. No responsibility. Here's your visa, but sign here. I'm like, oh, okay. So, that was a little bit of a wake-up call. But I did all the right things when I got there. You arrive at Kabul airport, as you know, as a civilian anyway, and you have to, you get off the plane, you go through passport control, and then you go to a desk and you give them a photograph of yourself and you fill in a form. I'm here. So I did that. And then I went to my hotel that I was staying in, and the owner kept asking me to provide him with a copy of my passport, my visa, and my registration. And I didn't want to get him into trouble. So after a few days, I did what is also the right thing. I went to the Foreign Ministry to register myself as a visiting foreign correspondent. And there's a whole comedy to be written about arriving there and waiting and all of that sort of thing. I was directed to a room where to wait for the spokesman to become available, and found myself in the middle of a French lesson for kids who wanted to be diplomats. So I was learning French in Dari, it was great. So then it was, oh, come on. So I went in, and there is the guy who calls himself Abdul Qadir Balki, real name Hassan Bahis, who's actually a New Zealander. And he's sitting behind the desk, this great big foreign ministry office with the Taliban flag, and he's got his gear on. And he's sitting there with this fake soft voice, and started being really, really rude to me. And I was being just polite. He was an official of a government that I wanted something from. He told me that the intelligence services did not recognize me as a journalist, and he read off a series of headlines of stories that he objected to. And he wanted me to give him the names and contact details for all of my sources. And I said, well, and the predominant theme of the stories that he took objection to was sex. So he pointed out the one about the sex slavery in Saigon, and another that I had done after the fall, maybe 6 months after, about LGBTQ people and the dangers they were facing and the desperation amongst that community to get out to safety. And he said, what are the names? Give me the details of all these people in this story about the sex slavery. And I said, you do your own work. Those people were citizens of a republic, and they were not afraid. So if you want to find them, you go find them. That's your job, not mine. And of course I'm not going to give you the names of anybody who used a false name, because what do you think I am? He told me that, and I said it anyway, that story was written before you even took over. And he picked up his phone and he looked at the date and he said, oh yeah. So he didn't even really know everything that he was talking about. He just wanted to be abusive. He called me a white supremacist colonialist. This is the misogynist from New Zealand, right? It's like, and my usual line is, my people are Irish, which you would know if you knew anything about how I spell my name, and we have been the victims of colonialism for many hundreds of more years than you. So there. But as politely as I possibly could, he asked me before he dismissed me if there was anything that he could do for me. And I said, yeah, could you please tell the NDS not to deport me? He said, no. He asked me, my driver came in, and my driver is a lovely man who worked with us and more closely with Masood while we were at the Associated Press. And he was just sitting on a sofa and he said, is this your fixer? I said, no, don't use a fixer. You don't use a fixer? No. He's my friend and he's driving me. So he started talking to him, and Nasir started saying, I'm so glad to have the Taliban here in control. Everything is so much safer and we have much greater security and all of this sort of stuff. But it didn't work. Later that afternoon, I had a few more meetings and I was sitting in the garden of a cafe. And the phone rang, and it was some guy from the NDS, Zahil, demanding that I come to his office. And I said, well, I'm just about to have a meeting. I could come later, after dinner perhaps. And he said, yeah, okay, I'll call you after I've had my dinner. And then he never called. And the next morning I went about appointments that I had, and my phone stopped working. I couldn't make calls or send texts, and I started to get a little bit twitchy about that. And I left a place where I was having a meeting, and there was a new white Toyota outside, the Taliban Toyotas, and two guys were sitting in it, but they didn't look at me as I walked past it. And we got into our car, and I turned to look at these guys, and they got out of their car and walked into the house I'd just come out of. And I went back to the hostel, and the guy from the GDI, as it's now called, the General Directorate of Intelligence, called, and I had an inkling that something serious was going to happen. So I had contacted Australian diplomats in Doha, and Masood, who by then was living in New Zealand, and I set up a WhatsApp group with location tracking, and I called and I booked a Pakistan Airlines flight out for the next morning. That was the next flight out, was the next morning. And because I had presciently got myself an online tourist visa for Pakistan before I left London. And so Zahil called, and I said, look, it's obvious that you don't want me here. That's fine. I've got the message. I've got myself a ticket out tomorrow, so why don't I just leave and we'll call it a day. He said, if you do not come to my office to confess your crimes, I will make sure that your name is on every exit port in the country, and you will not be allowed to leave the country until you come to my office and confess your crimes. So with this, my tummy tightened, and I said, okay, well, I'm staying at such and such a place. There's a nice cafe on, the 5th floor. Why don't I meet you there? So usually the drive from, even without traffic, because there was no traffic in Kabul anymore, usually the drive would be about 20 minutes. 4 minutes later, he called me and said, okay, we're in the cafe. So I went up to the cafe, and I was telling the Aussie Dips and Masood what was going on. And there were 4 of them there, one with a gun, one just hanging around, I guess, and 2 officials who were sitting down at a table. And I tried to be my usual charming self, and they weren't having any of it. And so I handed over my passport on demand. He took it out of the pink plastic Hello Kitty folder that I keep it in, and threw that on the table, threw my passport on the table, and looked at his mate sitting opposite him and said, "She knows what her crimes are." And he said, "Yeah, she knows what her crimes are. You know what your crimes are." I went, "Okay. Shall we have a chat? Coffee?" They said, "Okay, well, now we're leaving." So I had my phone and okay, now they're making me leave. I go with them. So they got into the lift. I got in with them. We went downstairs. We got into this up-armoured car, gunman and driver, and me and Zahil. And we're sitting there, and Masood knew where we were going, just down to the back, where it is in the Shashtarak, down behind where the NATO base was, which is where I guess you would have worked or spent a lot of time. And he put my passport back in its Hello Kitty cover and handed it back to me in the car. And I looked at him and I thought, this is a bit weird. And I said, "Do you have children?" And he leaned forward and he went to take something out of his pocket, and I thought maybe he was reaching for a gun and he was going to, something. And he got out his phone and he started going through his photos and showing me pictures of his kids.
Wow.
So I'm, texting. He's showing me pictures of his kids, And we got to the end. Yes, we went right to the back and then into a ground floor office, and there were guys sitting outside, Talibs on blankets having a picnic, and we went inside. It was just a typical over-furnished Afghan office with a big desk, dark wood desk, and overstuffed chairs and little coffee tables next to them, and an air conditioner and a glass-fronted cabinet and a fan that wasn't working, and they got me a cup of tea and put it on the table, and I'm sitting, I'm all covered up in a chador and a scarf, and sitting there with my phone, and they just didn't take my phone off me, but they started shouting at me. They stood around me and they started shouting at me questions. "There are no gays in Afghanistan. Why do you say there are gays in Afghanistan?" Stuff like this, and why do you call us terrorists? And, I would start to answer these questions, and then they would shout another one. So I'm getting an inkling of their methodology here. And eventually I said, "Look, guys, if you're not going to let me answer a question before you shout another one at me, there's just no point in this. It's not a conversation. If you want to have a proper conversation, I'm happy to do that. But otherwise, this is just pointless." And they looked at each other. "There are no gays in Afghanistan." "Well, you know that there are gays in Afghanistan." "No, there's a lot in Europe, but there's no gays in Afghanistan." "Okay, all right. Why do you call it?" "Well, I don't make this stuff up. Most of the leaders of the Taliban are actually listed by the United Nations Security Council Analytical and Sanctions Committee as terrorists. So that's what I'm going by, and why don't you say bad things about the Americans?" And I said, "You look at my record, you look at everything that I've ever written, and you will see no one is safe." It's like, come on. And it went on like this for a while, and I started to get texts from people asking me if I was okay. And my phone rang a couple of times and I didn't answer it. And then my editor, Keith, who I mentioned before, Keith Johnson from Foreign Policy, called, and he said, "There are rumours that something has happened to you. Are you safe?" That's not what he said. He said, "Are you in any danger?" And I said, "One moment, please. Mr. Zahil, am I in any danger?" And Zahil said, he's just sitting there playing with his phone, "We've got an air conditioner, you've got tea." The other guy said, I opened he'd given me a bottle of mineral water to drink, and I hadn't been able to open the lid, so I'd handed it to him, and he'd opened it for me. He said, and I opened your water for you. And Mr. Zahil said, so no, you're not in any danger. I said to Keith, Mr. Zahil says I'm not in any danger.
Wow.
And then I said to them, so how does this end? Oh, and the other guy whose name I never got, he had this beautiful big silver turban on. Just apropos of nothing, out of the blue, he said, I like cats too. So I looked at him and I turned around in my chair and I said, do you have a cat? And he shut down. Yeah, he shut down. Wow. Oops. Then I said, guys, how does this end? This went on for a number of hours. So there was a lot of, exchange going on. But eventually I said, so how does this end? And they said, well, you've got to say sorry. And I said, okay, I'm sorry. They said, no, you've got to be really sorry. And I said, okay, I'm really sorry.
Oh my God.
And they looked at each other and I said, oh, okay, you want me to make it public, like a confession or something? They went, yeah. I said, okay, so on what, on Twitter or something? They said, yeah. So I had closed down my Twitter, and they said, well, why did you close off your Twitter? And I said, well, just, less complicated, right? They said, okay, well, reopen your Twitter. Thank God I could remember the password. So I reopened Twitter. And they hadn't allowed me to take their photo or to take any notes. And the only time it looked like they were going to get violent was when I held my phone up to take their photo. And they tried to take it off me, and I just snatched it back. And that was the end of that little episode. They said to me that if I didn't make a confession, I would go to prison, that they would send me to jail if I didn't do it. I said, okay, whatever you want. They're making me confess. I'm still texting this amorphous group. So I said, what is it that you want me to say? And they told me exactly what it was they wanted me to say, and I wrote it down. And then they said, like, okay, now make a tweet. And so I typed it onto a tweet. And this kid who was in there, who had a huge, like, Galaxy Android type thingy, why, who knows, took my phone off me, and he turned the tweet into a thread. And then they said, okay, send it. And I said, just before I send it, I just want to tell you in all sincerity that this is going to make you look silly. And one of them said to the other, what does silly mean? And they had a debate about the meaning of the word silly, and then decided that they wouldn't look silly and they would make me do it anyway. And I said, okay, look, I'll do whatever you want, but just wanted to let you know. So I sent it. Then they got a call from their boss, who he had been on the phone to the whole time. At one time had tried to tell me that his boss was a woman and then put him on speaker, right? The boss didn't like it, so they wanted me to do it again. So we deleted that one. I still have a copy of it, and they made me do it again. And it is exactly the same as the first one. Retweeted it, and they were happy with that. And I said, okay, is that it? Because I have to go. I had a dinner engagement. Oh, and I also had an appointment with an American news podcast, a big one, one of the top 3 in the country, to talk to them, do a pre-recorded two-way about life in Afghanistan now the Taliban was in charge. So I sent them an email and said, I won't be able to make our appointment because I'm being detained by the Taliban. And I got an email back that said, okay, not to worry, we'll reschedule.
Oh my Lord.
I thought I just gave you guys a scoop there, Anyway, I had a dinner engagement. Yeah, I know. It was just madness. So I had a dinner, so I was really wanting to make dinner. But anyway, they said now we have to do a video recording. Oh, I said, okay. So then they moved all the furniture around, And they made me sit in one of them was there, one of them there. The kid with the great big, Android was there in front of me filming it. And I sat there and I undid my scarf, fluffed out my hair contemptuously, redid my scarf and said, so do I look all right? Do I need any more lipstick or anything? Am I looking okay? And they're like, no, you look fine. You look fine. Okay. And I said, what is it that you want me to say? And I said exactly what they wanted me to say. I said, my name is Lynne O'Donnell and I'm a journalist. I don't know anything about Afghan culture or Afghan people or the history of the country. I have no sources. I make up everything that I write. And I took my scarf off and I wound it around my neck and I said, and I haven't been coerced into making this confession. Which was also what they had told me to say. And they looked at me and they looked at each other and they looked at me again and we all burst out laughing.
Oh my gosh.
It was comic. And I said, well, sorry, will that do? They said, no, we'll have to do it again. So we did it again. I laughed through the whole second one just to make it unusable for them. And how's that? They said, okay. I said, well, now will you take, what happens now? Will you take me back to yeah, we'll take you back. So we're sitting in the back of the car again. I waved goodbye to the guys who were picnicking. They were still picnicking. I said, this is what you call Stockholm Syndrome. Bye, thanks for having me. One of them said, what? I said, look it up. They took me back. They took me back to my guest house and knocked on the gate and told the gateman to find the manager. And it took them a while to find the manager. When he came down, they told me to go inside and they talked to the manager. And he came up to my, this is like an apart hotel, he came up to my apartment a little while later, maybe 15 minutes, and he said that they had threatened him, told him that they can shut down his business at any time. So this is the way, they run things, just rule of fear. So I couldn't find Nasir, my driver, and he had disappeared, and there was no answer on his phone. And I went out to dinner. I kept my engagement for dinner. A couple of people called me and I told them that, I had been detained, but I was out now and I was leaving the next day. The next day I went to the airport with a friend of mine. I had breakfast with an old friend of mine and he drove me to the airport. And the PIA flight to Islamabad was delayed on the tarmac with the door open for 20 minutes. I'm still, on this WhatsApp group, and Masood and I are terrified, thinking maybe they're going to come and take me off the plane. It was really awful. And the reason for the delay was waiting for another flight with NGO people who were transferring from the boonies, maybe Herat or somewhere like that, onto the plane to get out to Pakistan. So while I was on the flight, a very short flight, as you know, I composed a tweet to send as soon as I was on Pakistani soil, which I sent, which was meant to be funny and make them look like fools, and also send a message that I had been detained, but now I was not only out of their detention, their custody, but also out of the country. Yeah. And so, Beth, I hate becoming the story. The word I rarely appears in any of the work that I do, because that's not the sort of journalism that I like or the sort of journalism that I do. There's a place for it, of course. But I had gone there into Afghanistan to write a story about what life was like under the Taliban, and they handed me a global platform to tell the world what the Taliban were like. I saw them. They treated me the way they thought they would get away with treating me, but obviously the way they treat people who don't have the protections that I have by being foreign, by having, nationality of 3 countries, by having the money to get visas and get on a plane and get out. They thought that I would be a simpering wet wreck in a corner, but that's not who I am. And if they thought they were going to frighten me, yeah, I was frightened, I was scared, but that's just a sign of intelligent life. I'd be stupid if I hadn't been scared. I didn't know how it was going to end. It was half a day. It could have been 6 months. Who knows? You never know, but there it was. It was half a day. I was interviewed by radio, television, newspapers, magazines, blogs, podcasters for a month. And so I was able to tell the entire world just what it's like in Afghanistan a year after the Taliban took over, how they treated me, what they said to me. Yeah. Yeah.
I will never forget reading that tweet for the first time and thinking that's not real, what happened, and being so concerned for you, and then seeing with relief, what happened afterwards. But I think the timing for you was very lucky too, because if we think about it, the Zawahiri strike was about a month later. A month later than that. Yeah. And that was when we started to see Westerners getting rolled up by the Taliban and not being let go. And
well, exactly.
Yes. I wonder.
Well, not just Westerners. Yeah. My friend Anas Malik, who is Pakistani, works for an Indian TV network, he drove past the house where Zawahiri had been held, and he was picked up, he was beaten up, he was detained and blindfolded for 2 days. And his local guys who were working with him as fixer, translator and driver were also beaten up. Guy came out with 3 broken ribs. There was the young American filmmaker who was also picked up in the same place, I think. I think there were more complications to that. Ivan, his name was, I think. Is that right? I did have some communication with him. But also I heard from people who had planned to go for the first anniversary whose editors said to them, no way. Sorry, after what happened to Lynne, no way. So the message got across, and it was the message that they wanted to send, But also I got my message across as well, I think. Yeah. I hope.
I think you did. I think people got to see firsthand what happens if you tell the truth in the Taliban's Afghanistan.
Yes.
And it's very dangerous. And I want to ask you two follow-ups before we close out here, but it's really hard to get media space where Afghanistan is concerned right now, but this situation hasn't changed. And how did what you experienced there, did that have an impact on your desire to keep covering things, to work with 8 a.m. media on the podcast? How did that play into what you're covering now?
Well, it was, you get a very high profile out of that sort of experience, which I did, which I don't mind at all. That was fine. I got the story across. And you probably know, because you're an avid follower of what is written and reported on about Afghanistan, that I did a lot of reporting, a lot of exclusive reporting. I had really great sources and people who wanted to give me great stories, and for a long time Foreign Policy was a great platform for that. And sometimes I was in the magazine, on the website anyway, 3 times a week, because the stories warranted it. As I said, my editor Keith really understood the value of this reporting, which was fantastic. But then Ukraine happened, and then you have had quite an interesting, to say the least, US election, then a campaign period, and of course there's been what happened in Gaza and the attack on the Israeli kibbutzim just over a year ago, and what that has led to, the conflagration or not in the Middle East. And so there isn't very much space, and Foreign Policy is a great, really great magazine for sure. But there's only so much bandwidth that the people who run it have, and they told me in April, well, the editor-in-chief told me in April that that no one's interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan anymore, which I find very disappointing. I know that he's running something that he has to, it has to be profitable, he has to employ other people, whatever. But I see what is happening in Afghanistan as centrifugal. It's not just in Afghanistan, and it's very well reported and documented by many more people than me that Al-Qaeda has been reconstituted there, that it is deeply embedded in the administration, that it is running training camps for jihadists and militants from all over the world, that it's working closely with the Haqqani network, that they are making money out of mining and using the cash and gold resources that they're pulling out of the ground to fund Al-Qaeda franchises all over the world, including East and West Africa, at a time when the French and the Americans are, pulling out of those parts of the world. The Taliban are very close to Hamas. Taliban leaders went to Iran to meet with Hamas leaders. They've offered fighters. This is a global jihadist terrorist project. It's happening. One of the last stories that I did, I think it may even be the last story that I did for Foreign Policy, was from Miran Shah in western Pakistan, where the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which is being sponsored by the Haqqani network, is fighting a very serious war against the Pakistani state. It is existential for the Pakistani state and underreported because no one's interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but hugely important for that part of the world. So at least I got that one in. 8 a.m, the podcast, 8 a.m. is running on grant money. It's not running on subscriptions. And so we are hoping that we'll be able to raise some money to keep that podcast going. I've done 22 episodes, closed out for the year, and hoping that we can start another season next year if 8 a.m. is able to get money. I might also mention that 8 a.m. isn't the only Afghan media group doing good work. I'd really like a shout out to Rukshana Media, which is run by Zoya Jara, literally on the smell of an oily rag. She's I don't know how she keeps it together, really. She needs funding, and she's doing great work on issues directly pertaining to the situation of women there. The same as 8 a.m. does on, imprisoned women, torture. She uncovered a video of a woman being raped in some sort of custody situation. So I find it, just to get back to that about, where's the interest? There was a point at which, after about a year and a half, it was very clear that whatever story Foreign Policy was going to run had to be a big whammy. And so that is what, pushed me on to all the exclusive reporting that I was doing, and a little bit of commentary in there as well. But Foreign Policy is no longer in the picture, so now it's finding stories that will find traction with other outlets, like The Spectator publishes my stuff, Airmail, which is an American online site run by Graydon Carter, formerly of Vanity Fair. So you're squeezing serious stuff in there between film reviews and fashion, So, yeah. But Vanity Fair did that too, and very, very successfully. So yeah, I think Beth, it's a real struggle. I enjoy writing about Afghanistan because I think that it's worthwhile writing about. I think it's important. I have suspicions that the attacks on me that have come from surprising corners, some not so surprising, like Saad Mohseni, who is the man behind the owner of Tolo News, which was a very respectable independent TV network in Afghanistan, which has now become known as Taliban News. He has attacked me, written to my editors, told them that my stories are bullshit, that I make stuff up. Now, why he would do that, I don't know, but, I told the Northern Alliance guys that Saad is not your friend. If he's attacking me, he's part of the problem. The World Food Programme wrote vicious letters to my editors at Foreign Policy, demanding corrections and retractions until the story was proved by the United States representative to the UN, to UNOCHA, to be, it was confirmed at that level, and then WFP released a press release to Reuters confirming the story, but no apology, Wow. The head of UNOCHA, who's just retired, a British diplomat called Martin Griffiths, went on to the BBC's flagship daily news program and told them that my reporting was calumny. I had to look it up to make sure I'd heard what I thought I'd heard. It means falsehood with nefarious intent. So I also complained about him, and my complaint was upheld, but no consequences for these bastards, So not only the Taliban have attacked me and called me a liar, but the United Nations, who, by the way, my taxes pays for, the United Nations, the world, UNOCHA, the UNAMA guys, they haven't liked me at all. WFP, it's been a slog. And the reason that they do this is to plant a seed of doubt, which I think they've done successfully, about the veracity of my reporting. After WFP also wrote to my editors at National Public Radio, NPR, after I had been on a live Q&A. Now, I have a good friend in the foreign editor there, and we talked about it. No problem with my reporting. I backed it up, etc. They never, ever invited me back. That's what it's all about. It's to push you out of the space. And I feel like Afghanistan has been pushed out of the space.
100%.
And along with it me, but pushing me out of the space means Afghanistan and the reality of what is happening in Afghanistan and the danger that Afghanistan under the Taliban now poses, not only to Pakistan next door or to the women, but to the whole world, because it's a jihadist project, has been pushed out of the space. Yeah, yes. And to the shame of media owners, really, to the shame of editors who have bowed to that. Shame on you. Shame on you.
I've been really grateful that the Washington Examiner continues to give my pieces a home and give Afghans a voice, because it's just, and Fox News too, not as often, just because it's, there's other things that are taking national attention as well, but it's so important. If I told every story that came across my inbox, I would never stop writing about Afghanistan. Oh my God. And I would love that.
You'd never sleep. Yeah.
No, but I would love that. I don't, that's like, it's so important. And I think we're taking our eye off the ball. As you've mentioned, Al-Qaeda is resurgent. We're now giving Siraj Haqqani, applauding pieces in the New York Times. Like, one day we will look back on this and say, thank God there were people who were continuing to pay attention, because they're going to be needed again. And it's
we're on the right side of history, Beth, and
yes.
And that's what nobody wants my stuff. Screw you. I know that I'm on the right side of history, and so are you.
Yes, and I just don't want it, for my children's generation to be the same thing again. And that's what I fear is going to happen. We will once again reinvent the wheel and once again say that we understand Afghanistan but not understand it, because the people who really put in the effort, who did care deeply, were sidelined when it mattered. And the people who don't know jack shit about what they're talking about are the ones who we still look at and say, hey, look, it's an expert. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm just...
Or those with an agenda. Like Saad Husseini's agenda, I'm sure, is just to keep the free money coming. And,
right.
you know, so, you're absolutely right. You just got to plug away at it and know that you're right and that it has value.
Yeah, and that you're helping humanity. I think that's the part that every time, you know, I can't tell you how many Afghans say, well, maybe if you tell my story, it will change my situation. And I used to believe that too. And now I just say, hey, look, I don't think it's going to do that. I just don't want you to get your hopes up. That's not going to happen, but it's still valuable. It's still valuable. This is the first draft of history, and your voice deserves to be in it. So my last question is to get this off, you know, this is obviously taken a realistic turn, which in this sense means a negative one, but what is your hope for the future of Afghanistan? Where do you think there are moments of maybe a bright light that could turn into something good?
Oh, well, my hope would be that the Taliban pack their bags, realise they're not welcome, and then just disappear into a cave somewhere and die. But realistically, I think that we have... Afghanistan in the form that it is in at the moment, getting worse and worse for some time yet. It's playing into the hands of realpolitik. The Chinese Communist Party, China, has been friendly with the Taliban for as long as they have existed. Now, they are going in there in the hope of being able to trade stuff like surveillance equipment for access to minerals contracts. Now, that's working. They've got their feet on the ground. They're not all of their contracts are successful, but they are getting access, and that's what they want. And they also want to be able to put roads and rails through to markets in Europe, through Central Asia and Europe, for the crap that they make in their factories, right? Because that's how their economy continues to turn over, and they need that. But the fact is that the Taliban is not a recognised government, and so all of those contracts will be worthless when the Taliban are no longer there. I think also that Afghanistan will continue to be a source of drugs, heroin. There is no end to the opium stocks that they have, so heroin will continue to come out of Afghanistan, but also increasingly so will meth. Methamphetamine, which is much cheaper and easier to make without the human element. You don't need to pay and feed people in the same numbers who grow poppy to make meth. I think that will continue. I think that the transport links that have sent heroin all over the world for decades from Afghanistan are being repurposed for weapons, antiquities, other contraband, money for Al-Qaeda cells we mentioned before, to get people into the training camps, that Al-Qaeda's reconstitution will continue to be under the radar, and that Osama bin Laden's original project we are already seeing the beginnings of in the Middle East, and that the Taliban are intimately tied to that.
Well, that is all very real and true, and I fear for it too. I do wish that they would pack their bags, or that, you know, some militia would come and make them leave. They are not wanted, but the longer that they are there, the more people behave as if they are wanted. It's the Nasir saying, oh, we like it here because it's safe, because what else are you going to say? You don't want to die, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
So...
Yeah, but then the other thing is that it's being upheld. There is a collusion. $40 million in cash a week going in there is not alleviating poverty or hunger. Right. It just isn't. And so, you know, I do think, and I was discussing this with a friend of mine a little while ago, that if you sent in 39 million next week, and 38 million the week after that, and 37 million the week after that. And you just started to send a message that it's not all for free. In 40 weeks, they'd have no money. Then you'd hear from them. And all of this rubbish about bending over when the Taliban say, yeah, we'll come to your next, free meeting in Doha, as long as women and civil society can't come. Put your foot down. You say, no, these are, if you want to be part of, if you want this from us, if you want anything at all from us, these are the conditions. So there's just this rolling over. Western women who are diplomats there go in looking like the Taliban want them to look. It's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't play their game. Exactly. So, there's no consequences. And until there are consequences, whether it's I know that the Haqqani and ISKP are in cahoots together. Is it another Moscow that happens in Tokyo or New York or, Sydney or wherever else? Is it going to be another 9/11 style, or is it just going to be this awful expanding war that we've seen since the October 7 attack, leading to the destruction of Israel and the victory of misogynistic, homophobic terrorism?
Yeah, we are not calling spades right now. We are calling them friends, it seems like. And we need to realign our moral compass, I think, in many places.
Yep.
Lynne, this has been amazing. I've loved hearing your stories, and I know that there are so many more that I didn't get to hear, but I just appreciate so much getting to learn about the things you've seen and done, and just the chutzpah that you showed in Taliban custody. I don't think I could have played it that cool. I'm very in awe of you. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm sure you would have. It's just like, come on, guys.
Maybe after I wet myself, there probably would have been some serious fear there. It's very amazing. You had seen so many things before that, right? That I think that all of those things enable you to be strong in a difficult circumstance, and that's what you were, and I think that's amazing. So thank you again just for being here and taking the time.
Thanks, Beth. It's been my honor. Thanks a lot. Not too boring, I hope.
Oh, never. Oh my gosh. Not even a single moment was boring. I want to also thank listeners for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan who are still trying to find that future that they were promised for 20 years, that it's a brief intermission right now. If you've enjoyed the episode, make sure you're following the page, enabling notifications and all that good stuff. And for now, Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you again soon.